2 girls vanished in the jungle. Days later, their phones kept calling 911, but someone no longer knew the passcode. Weeks later, their bones were found scattered, a foot still inside a shoe, untouched by animals. One photo was mysteriously deleted. Another showed blood in Kris's hair. Was it an accident or something far more chilling? A single hiking boot sat abandoned on the muddy riverbank. Inside it, a severed left foot remained intact, the shoelaces still cinched tightly across pale, bloated skin. A strip of human flesh, rolled like a damp cloth, lay nearby, partially buried beneath wet leaves. No blood, no drag marks, no visible signs of struggle, just silence, and something far more unsettling: the surgical precision of absence. 10 weeks earlier, 2 Dutch university students, Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon, had disappeared without a trace in the cloud forests of Panama. No credible witness ever confirmed seeing them after April 1st, the day they set out for what was supposed to be a short hike on the Pianista Trail in Phuket. They were not naive travelers. Both had strong academic records, came from stable families, and planned the trip carefully: language study, volunteer work, and brief trekking excursions. Their itinerary was public, shared with family, and structured around scheduled schoolwork. What turned their journey into a fatal misstep wasn't poor planning. It was overconfidence or manipulation. The day they vanished, weather conditions were calm. Both were dressed for a casual walk, not a deep jungle excursion. They left behind critical survival tools: no compass, no flashlight, no spare clothing. Photographs from a digital Canon camera later recovered showed Kris and Lisanne smiling at high elevation, likely just past the trail summit. Yet their positioning, body language, and framing of the photos became increasingly irregular. The last clear image, taken in daylight, showed Kris standing inside a moss-covered ravine. Her expression was subdued, her stance tight. Her gaze, directed back toward the camera, carried the unmistakable strain of unease. Several behavioral markers in the image contradict the natural joy of earlier frames. There is a visible increase in interpersonal distance between the 2 women. The symmetry and framing of the photos are inconsistent, suggesting a breakdown in rhythm or cohesion. The visual record does not show fear, but it shows the rupture of comfort. At this point in the trail, a critical behavioral shift likely occurred. The girls did not turn back as the signs instructed. Instead, they continued past the summit, a decision incompatible with their profile unless influenced by external stimuli. Multiple hypotheses arise here. One possibility is that they were being shadowed by an unknown individual who offered guidance, assistance, or a sense of safety. In similar cases involving isolated victims in unfamiliar terrain, manipulative perpetrators often present themselves as benign at first, gradually isolating their targets further from help. The forest beyond the Pianista Trail is not a safe zone. It transitions rapidly from structured pathways into chaotic, unmapped wilderness with poor visibility and aggressive topography. Locals, including experienced indigenous guides, avoid those sections unless absolutely necessary. It is unlikely that Kris and Lisanne continued deeper into that environment by choice, unless under pressure, whether psychological or circumstantial. It is also statistically rare for 2 cognitively capable adults to misjudge the return route at the same time, especially with a functioning camera and 2 phones in their possession. A dual breakdown in navigation and decision-making without external interference remains improbable. The absence of screams, calls, or signs of struggle suggests either rapid incapacitation or compliance under perceived safety. Neither woman attempted to send a message to family or friends, even when phone reception flickered briefly in the following days. They only tried to call emergency numbers, not personal contacts. This pattern indicates a controlled environment in which external communication may have been discouraged or feared. A closer look at the final known photo, Kris framed in the ravine, reveals something more subtle. Her body leans slightly away from the camera. Her shoulders are elevated, jaw tense, hands not visible. The image is grainy, but the posture is defensive. If that was the moment they first encountered danger, it wasn't explosive. It was slow, methodical, and silent. The kind of fear that creeps in under the guise of calm. What happened next would not be documented again in daylight. After this frame, there are no more smiling photos, no attempts at selfies. The girls had entered a phase of survival, or subjugation, and whoever or whatever they encountered in that forest, it didn't need to chase them. It only needed to wait. The forest did not take them all at once. It took them by permission, hesitation, and silence. But who, or what, stood behind the camera when Kris looked back that final time? The first emergency call was placed at 4:39 p.m. on April 1st. It came from Lisanne Froon's phone. The device briefly searched for signal, failed to connect, then powered off. Over the following days, a pattern emerged. A sequence of silent distress signals cast blindly into a dead zone. By April 6th, nearly 80 separate attempts had been made from both phones to reach either Dutch Emergency Services 112 or Panama's local equivalent 911. None connected successfully, except for one brief call on the morning of April 2nd. It lasted only seconds before dropping without a trace. The behavioral implications of this sequence are significant. The frequency of attempts, many occurring at regular 1 to 2 hour intervals, points to deliberate action, not panic. The operators were conserving battery, regulating their access windows, and likely moving to higher ground in search of reception. This suggests at least one individual remained mentally competent and physically capable for several days after the initial disorientation. However, none of these calls were directed to friends, family, or local contacts. There were no text messages sent. The phones were used exclusively to call emergency lines. This anomaly can be explained in several ways. It may indicate a belief that direct lines were more likely to trigger GPS tracing or triangulation. It may also suggest an environment in which non-emergency communication was discouraged, potentially by a coercive presence nearby. Forensic extraction of device logs revealed another anomaly. Between April 1st and 5th, both phones were accessed with valid PIN codes. The users retained full access to their devices, which supports the premise that both women were alive and actively trying to reach help. But on April 6th, this changed. Kris Kremers' phone, the only one still operational at that point, began registering incorrect PIN attempts. Over the next several days, dozens of failed entries were logged. The correct code was never entered again, and yet the phone continued to be powered on and off at irregular intervals, often for less than a minute at a time. This shift marks a critical inflection point in the behavioral timeline. The knowledge of the correct PIN had been lost. There are two plausible explanations. The first is that the device had passed into the hands of someone other than the original user, either Lisanne, after Kris became incapacitated, or a third party. The second is that the person using the phone deliberately input the wrong PIN to unlock content or access stored data, but failed to do so due to unfamiliarity with the device. What makes this transition concerning is not merely the failed PIN attempts, but the persistence behind them. A single mistake might be attributed to stress. Dozens, over a span of days, indicate fixation, the kind observed in subjects attempting to retrieve or erase specific information. Given that emergency calls can be placed without unlocking the phone, this behavior cannot be explained as a desperate attempt to call for help. It was an attempt to breach the device's interior, suggesting knowledge that the phone may contain sensitive material, such as photos or messages, that could compromise the user's position. The device itself retained sufficient charge during this period. Diagnostic data showed that battery levels remained within usable thresholds for at least 4 days beyond the last correct PIN entry. This means the person handling the phone made a conscious decision to continue engaging with the device, knowing they were unable to fully access it. On the night of April 8th, the Canon camera, recovered later inside Lisanne's backpack, was activated again after a full week of inactivity. Between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., 90 photos were taken in complete darkness. The images were erratic, blurred, and inconsistent. Some showed close-ups of rocks, foliage, or the jungle floor. One appeared to be the back of Kris's head, possibly with dried blood visible in her hair. Another captured a makeshift arrangement of sticks and plastic, possibly constructed as a signal or marker. The flash was used in every image. In this context, the camera may have served multiple purposes: as a crude flashlight, as a signaling device, or as an instrument for documentation. Yet the framing of the photos suggests no coherent attempt to record a route or escape path. They were not methodical, they were compulsive. Behavioral analysis of nighttime photo sequences in other missing persons cases reveals a pattern. Survivors under duress sometimes use cameras not only as tools, but as companions. The act of taking photos creates a sense of action, of presence. In other cases, perpetrators use the victim's device to stage or erase evidence, sometimes failing to remove all images due to haste or ignorance. The precise origin of the April 8th images remains unconfirmed. No fingerprints were recoverable from the device, and no human subjects were directly photographed. If Lisanne was alive and attempting to use the flash as a beacon, it indicates she was mobile, disoriented, and likely alone. If the images were taken by a third party, it suggests calculated intent to manipulate the digital record, or document the aftermath of control. But the most chilling indicator remains the failed PIN entries, beginning immediately after April 6th. The shift from structured survival behavior to compulsive, unproductive interactions with the device implies a break in continuity. The person now holding the phone was not the same as the one making emergency calls just days before. Not mentally, and possibly not physically. Why would a perpetrator continue turning on a phone they could not unlock? Was it an effort to harvest data, or to make it appear the victims were still alive, long after they were not? On June 17th, a local Nyabe woman approached police with an unusual item she had found near a riverbank in Alto Romero, several kilometers north of the known trail systems. It was a blue backpack, dry, intact, and without visible wear, despite having allegedly endured over 10 weeks of exposure to Panama's extreme humidity and consistent rainfall. The pack was immediately recognized as belonging to Lisanne Froon. Inside were 2 pairs of sunglasses, a water bottle, 2 bras folded neatly on top, a small amount of cash, Lisanne's passport, Kris's insurance card, a digital Canon camera, and both mobile phones. No signs of damage, no signs of waterlogging. The contents were well organized, suggesting the bag had either been kept in a dry, protected space for an extended period, or planted deliberately at the discovery site shortly before being found. The logistical implications are clear. Either the bag had remained shielded from the elements in a concealed location, or it had been placed there by an individual with direct access to the victim's belongings, likely after their deaths. This scenario raises significant doubts regarding the passive disappearance theory. A naturally lost backpack, exposed to the open jungle for over 2 months, would not remain in pristine condition. Furthermore, no scavenging activity was observed. The arrangement of items inside suggested intention, not accident. Days later, search teams found a boot further upstream. Inside it, Lisanne's left foot remained, partially decomposed but still inside the laced shoe. The surrounding terrain offered no signs of predation, no deep gashes, no evidence of dragging. The ankle had been cleanly severed, without trauma markings typically left by wild animals. A nearby piece of skin, human, dermal, and rolled into a tube, was discovered buried under wet foliage. It retained elasticity and did not show advanced signs of decomposition. This is atypical in environments where tissue is exposed to constant moisture and bacterial growth. In the following weeks, additional remains began to surface along the same stretch of river. Over 30 bone fragments were recovered, spread across a zone less than 3 kilometers in length. The bones belonged to both victims. Among the most notable was Kris Kremers' pelvic bone, which was found completely clean, stripped of all organic tissue, white and brittle. Other bones appeared similarly bleached. In contrast, several of Lisanne's fragments still held traces of soft tissue. No full skeletons were located, and no skulls. The differential state of decomposition between the two victims indicates variation in both time of death and post-mortem treatment. One body appears to have been exposed longer and possibly placed in a location subjected to sun and heat, accelerating tissue breakdown. The other shows signs of preservation, consistent with cooler, darker, or protected environments. This disparity cannot be reconciled with a theory involving simultaneous death in a shared location. Moreover, the absence of full skeletal coherence, no bones articulated, no spinal groupings, suggests intentional dismemberment or transportation. River flow could explain some scattering, but the precision and condition of the bones point toward human interference. In particular, the presence of clean cuts and missing high-density bones like femurs and ribs weakens arguments for animal scavenging or natural separation. In cases involving disarticulated remains with no defensive wounds or fractures, patterns often align with offenders who operate in isolated environments and exert control after death. The lack of struggle indicators or trauma suggests the victims were incapacitated before death or died in a state of submission. The retention of clean anatomical fragments, especially in separate conditions, implies either staging or segmented disposal. Psychologically, this behavior corresponds with a subject displaying high degrees of compartmentalization, the ability to suppress emotion, and handle dismemberment in phases. These offenders often prioritize concealment, not through burial or destruction, but through environmental obfuscation. The choice to spread bones along a riverbed, where they may be lost or mistaken for animal remains, reflects knowledge of both terrain and investigative limitations in rural settings. The folded bras in this backpack and the absence of personal defensive wounds reinforce a low-violence, high-control model. This dynamic appears in offenders with obsessive tendencies, who rely on manipulation rather than force. In similar cases, the victim's belongings are sometimes preserved, not out of sentiment, but to maintain psychological ownership, a form of dominance that continues post-mortem. The forensic inconsistency in tissue decay remains the most revealing element. Skin retaining texture after 10 weeks in the jungle contradicts expected biological timelines. If stored in a cooler space, such as a cave, dugout, or man-made shelter, this preservation becomes more plausible. But it also confirms an ongoing presence, someone who tended to, relocated, or staged the remains over time. Why were some bones exposed to the elements, while others were likely protected for weeks before being placed? And who had both the access and the knowledge to manage such a task without ever being seen? In the behavioral profile of offenders who do not strike quickly but instead operate over time, control is rarely achieved through violence alone. It is maintained through containment, spatial, psychological, and procedural. In this case, no evidence supports a sudden ambush or frenzied assault. There are no signs of immediate trauma, no clear point of fatal injury, no physical struggle. Instead, every major development unfolds slowly. The failed emergency calls, the gradual decay in communication, the unexplained nighttime photographs, and the staggered appearance of remains. This pacing is not accidental. It reflects a subject who prefers sustained control over rapid domination. The goal is not destruction, but possession, not to end life immediately, but to manage it, dismantle it, and ultimately erase it on their terms. The retention and strategic placement of personal items, particularly those with emotional or identity-bearing weight, serve as behavioral signatures. A folded passport, a carefully preserved shoe, and the methodical disassembly of skeletal remains are not random. They suggest a process, one in which the offender manipulates time, not only for concealment, but as a means of control. The transition between survival behavior and post-mortem manipulation occurs in phases. Initial evidence indicates that at least one victim remained alive for several days following the disappearance. During this period, emergency calls were made, devices were managed responsibly, and survival logic was maintained. Then, behavior shifted. Photographs were taken at night with no identifiable subject. Access to phones was lost, and remains later appeared in states inconsistent with natural exposure. This arc implies a transfer of agency. Someone else began to dictate the narrative, and the victims became objects within it. The method of post-event handling is particularly relevant. Offenders who disarticulate remains not for concealment, but for staging often demonstrate a need to retain symbolic pieces. They do not seek anonymity. They seek silent authorship. The placement of body parts in inconsistent environmental conditions suggests compartmentalized thinking, the desire to separate the act from the consequences, or to create psychological zones that mirror internal fragmentation. This type of behavior is observed in individuals with high-functioning external presentation and deeply disordered internal structures. They do not act out of impulse, but out of script. Control also extends into memory. By altering timelines, withholding key items, and introducing misleading evidence, the offender attempts to rewrite what happened. The camera's memory card was intact, but one image had been deleted. A single gap in an otherwise unbroken sequence. This action required navigation of the device's interface, implying basic technical knowledge and intent. A single missing image rarely holds significance, unless it captures something worth hiding. In this case, its absence becomes a focal point. It suggests the presence of something, or someone, the offender did not want preserved. In similar long-form offenses, offenders with obsessive tendencies often return to the scene or remain nearby. The area where the backpack and bones were found lies far from the original trail, but within reachable proximity of local dwellings. It is not impossible that the individual responsible observed search efforts, adjusted accordingly, and planted select evidence when discovery became inevitable. Such behavior has precedent in cases where offenders seek indirect acknowledgement of control without exposing themselves. The retention of the foot inside the boot, fully laced, is particularly anomalous. It was not buried, not destroyed, and not consumed by wildlife. Its state of preservation contrasted with other remains. This may reflect a symbolic act, preservation of identity, memory, or access. In forensic psychology, lower limbs can represent restriction or entrapment. For the offender, keeping the foot intact and visible may have served as a reminder, a mark of what was held even after death. The same can be said for the camera. It was not smashed, lost, or erased entirely. It remained functional, holding both benign images of joy and disturbing images of darkness. It became a totem, a dual narrative device that held both life and decay. This style of control, nonviolent, symbolic, and methodically paced, reflects a specific offender profile. Likely male, solitary, with local knowledge and comfort in isolation. Not a predator in the traditional sense, but a collector. Someone who prefers passive domination, who dismantles trust rather than breaches it. The manipulation of evidence, the delay in exposure, and the effort to fragment both body and narrative point toward a subject who seeks to erase without vanishing completely. What remains unanswered is the choice. Why preserve the foot and not the body? Why delete one photo and not the others? What compelled this individual to edit so selectively and to leave behind just enough to be remembered? The official explanation attributed the deaths of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon to a hiking accident. According to this version, the two young women became lost, injured, and ultimately succumbed to exposure deep in the Panamanian jungle. The theory relies on two assumptions: that disorientation led them off trail, and that nature alone was responsible for their deaths. However, an examination of behavioral patterns, digital records, physical evidence, and forensic inconsistencies does not support this conclusion. There is no evidence of disorganized panic during the initial days. The emergency call logs reveal deliberate, spaced attempts for help, consistent with cognitive control and survival planning. There was no misuse of battery power, no random dialing, no efforts to contact non-emergency numbers. The devices were handled with restraint. In similar cases of accidental disorientation, subjects often reach out to known contacts for guidance or comfort. The absence of such behavior in this case suggests either external restriction or a belief that help would come from within their environment, possibly from someone who had positioned themselves as an ally. The timeline of technological activity further undermines the accident narrative. The sudden loss of PIN access after April 6th, coupled with continued activation of the phone, indicates a change in user. That change did not coincide with device damage or loss, but with behavioral discontinuity. The individual using the phone lacked personal knowledge of the victim's code, yet remained intent on unlocking it over many days. This is consistent with secondary access, a third party attempting to extract data or ensure the removal of incriminating content. The discovery and condition of the remains reflect active human involvement. Bones were not found in natural clusters, but scattered across a calculated radius. Some were sun-bleached, others preserved. There were no signs of animal interference consistent with jungle predation. No soft tissue trauma indicative of a fall from height. Clean separations at the ankle, as seen with the severed foot, are anatomically rare in environmental deaths unless there is decomposition over several months or dismemberment. In this case, neither condition was satisfied. Furthermore, the placement of the backpack, dry, intact, and fully functional, cannot be reconciled with a passive loss in the wild. The environment in which it was discovered had seen weeks of rainfall. The items inside, including paper documents and electronics, showed no signs of water exposure. The conclusion is unavoidable. The bag had been stored in a protected location and placed at the riverbank intentionally at a later stage. These findings, when mapped behaviorally, match a profile of calculated post-crime control. The individual responsible displayed traits of organized behavior, delayed disclosure, and psychological staging. The offender did not seek financial gain. There was no demand for ransom, no use of stolen identities, no traceable benefit. This points toward an internal motivation, one rooted in dominance, psychological manipulation, or ritualized control. The subject likely possessed local knowledge, access to off-grid shelter, and a high degree of comfort in isolated terrain. The absence of any third-party sighting suggests non-impulsivity. This was not an opportunistic act. It was premeditated in the sense that the environment and the circumstances were used as tools. The method of control, spatial isolation, gradual deprivation, removal of agency, is consistent with nonviolent coercive patterns often observed in captor scenarios where physical restraint is replaced by psychological collapse. There is no evidence that Kris or Lisanne ever attempted to flee, signal publicly, or physically resist. Their behavior implies they were either manipulated into a belief system that discouraged outside contact, or monitored in such a way that resistance became unthinkable. The use of their own devices against them, particularly the selective deletion of data, suggests the offender operated within their psychological space, not just their physical one. The final state of the remains, especially the presence of the foot in the boot, represents more than a forensic anomaly. It is a symbol of incomplete erasure. The perpetrator removed much, but not all. Left just enough for reconstruction, but never the whole truth. This is common among individuals who do not fear discovery, but crave selective acknowledgement. They leave behind fragments as markers of power, not regret. The deaths of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon were not the result of disorientation, injury, or a tragic fall. They were the outcome of an encounter with an individual who preferred to remain unseen, who dismantled autonomy through environment, time, and subtle constraint. An individual who did not seek attention, but orchestration. Who did not kill with visible force, but through quiet removal of options. This person remains unidentified, not because the evidence does not exist, but because it was curated. What remains is not only an unsolved case, but a psychological wound, inflicted not only on the victims and their families, but on the very systems meant to interpret what happened. The jungle did not swallow them. Someone used the jungle to make it appear as if it had.